What up, though? And uh, welcome to African American Studies 477 Power and Protest, Week 5, which is a really dope thing for me. If you were with me last semester, we did 5 classes total, and now we halfway through because we're doing 10 this time around. But I want to introduce myself and welcome you to the space. Dwayne Barnes, MPA, coming at you with African American Studies 477 Power and Protest. A look at the civil rights movement from 1955 to 1968. We've been on a really good road so far. So for those who don't know, I started this class, African Americans 477, earlier this year when the current administration took over. A lot of people were feeling some type of way, whispering, pispering, worried about what was going to happen with our rights, what was going to happen with, our people as a whole, our community. And so, being an African American studies major from back in the day and having this information and having a passion and calling to do this work, I was led to start the first class, which was AAS 477, Economics of Jim Crow, where we looked at the Jim Crow era, specifically around the perspectives of W.E.B. Du Bois and his Talented Tenth, Booker T. Washington and his Do for Self, and Marcus Garvey and his Back to Africa or Nationalist Perspective. Fast forward, we started this class 5 weeks ago now, civil rights, where we wanted to look at the people, policies, and impact of civil rights, specifically starting around Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954, and ending around the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. So this week, there we go. Direct action, escalation, definitely around the Freedom Summer of 1964. But we'll be talking about Megard Evers and his plight and his assassination and how his case was finally solved. We'll spend a lot of time talking about the Freedom Summer of 1964. And then we'll end our conversation around the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party and their plight for representation at the Atlantic City Democratic Convention in 1964. But before we get to all that, let's go to some of our objectives and our why we're doing this from a technical perspective. So I'm gonna share my screen here. Give me just a second. All right, you should be able to see this. So of course, details. Oh yeah, I want to do that. We'll start with the objectives. So we want to critically analyze strategies and tactics and philosophies employed by the civil rights movement to understand the historical context of racial segregation, discrimination in the United States, and then to examine the roles the key figures and organizations played in the movement, to explore the complexities of social change that was facilitated by these activists, and then to foster critical thinking, definitely in discussion around the civil rights movement. So that's what we're doing here today. Let me stop sharing my screen and get back to the good stuff. So before we get too deep into this week, we want to take a peek back to what we talked about last week. Last week was a really, really, really good lesson. We talked about the Albany movement and the lessons learned through activism. We saw how many viewed Albany as a loss for the movement, which it really wasn't. It was a lesson that progressed into the Birmingham movement, specifically around the Children's Crusade. So I always like to say, when you remember seeing the dogs and the hoses and the fights that's happening, that's usually the one time that you see that during the Children's Crusade, where high school kids were set out in Birmingham, Alabama to lead the movement, basically. And then we finished it with the March on Washington, a seminal moment for the civil rights movement, bringing together over 250,000 people to Washington to fight for jobs, freedom, and equality. That one moment was a seminal moment for a lot of different reasons. And if you were with me last week, and you know why. If you're interested in getting any of this information, I'll drop the link in the chat for the email that I send out with the session outlines, video, links to a ton of information. So the Freedom Summer, our conversation today is going to be very centered around voting rights in the state of Mississippi. Some names that you may know or may have heard before: Megard Evers, Fannie Lou Hamer, which is I have a lot more love and respect for Fannie Lou Hamer, in doing this class and getting more, information. And I was actually a part of the the Freedom Schools movement in Washington, D.C. So it's something, well, the site that I was at was in Detroit, but then I ran a creative writing class for some scholars in DC early in my career. So Freedom Schools and the Freedom Summer is very close to me. And then the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party that looked to get some representation at the federal level as it relates to the 1964 Democratic Convention. So let me pull up some info here and we can get going. So let's set the stage here. Here we are, 1960. Well, let's take a step back. 1962. Megard Evers is a civil rights icon that, to me, really doesn't get his just due because he was taken down early in his career and in his plight to solve some issues in Mississippi, specifically around voting rights and access. So Megard Evers was he was so much. So let's just start. He fought for change in Mississippi. He volunteered for World War II as a young man. So he said, you know what? I got to get it going. I got to get it popping. I got to get it cracking. And he did. He came home and wanted to continue the fight for his people. So he got affiliated with the NAACP. He was actually the first NAACP. Here we go. NAACP field secretary, state of Mississippi. And so his plight was integration, voting rights. And so what really brought the rubber to the road, or the rubber met the road with Megard Evers, was his fight against integration or segregation. So in 1963, he led the protest at the Woodworth store, the Woodworth Five and Dime. If you remember from last week or 2 weeks ago, the Five and Dimes are where the lunch counter sit-ins that the students led were. So this is a local store where sometimes they would serve you, let you come in and go to the store, and they wouldn't let you go to the lunch counter. Other times they would let you, they wouldn't let you in and let you do anything. Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for joining today. So Megard Evers started, really around that and, organizing people, energizing people, getting them ready to roll in the struggle. He, in his efforts, his home was bombed. But, that never really, turned away our civil rights leaders, because that was just a part of the process. They were ready and willing to die for what they believed in. But let's set the scene a little more. So we're talking Jackson, Mississippi. A couple weeks ago, we talked about the freedom rides that ended up in Jackson, Mississippi. A couple weeks before that, we talked about school desegregation with James Meredith, who was looking to integrate the University of Mississippi. So we're a long, deep, dark history in Mississippi around, Black folks looking to integrate and white folks looking to stop them. And so, kind of to set the stage. So the fight in Mississippi was a very particular one, because though the 15th Amendment passed, which was the right to vote for all people, we talked about in the other class how Jim Crow and those laws made it very difficult for people to vote. So we're talking about poll taxes, we're talking about literacy tests, we're talking about grandfather clauses, and we're just talking about the overall violence and intimidation that comes from going to the courthouse and saying, I want to register to vote. The powers that be were organized through what they call, so it was kind of twofold. During the day, they were organized through the Citizens Council. I call it the White Citizens Council, but the Citizens Council. So you had business elite, political elite, average everyday people joining this organization with the number one goal is to hold on to power and do it through segregation. And the main tool they wanted to navigate through was through voting rights. And so, if you were attempting to find yourself eligible to vote, you had to face a litany of things. If you were a small business owner and you got a loan, they trying to call that loan in. If you had products on shelves somewhere, they looking to kill your inventory. If you got a job and you just work for one of these folks, Well, now you lost your job. So they were making it a situation where you didn't want to come down to that courthouse and put your name on that roll. And if you put your name on the roll, you could face backlash. And then they also had a registrar system to where you go in, even if you got all your information right, you were told that you had to interpret one of the 22 statutes inside of the Mississippi Constitution. And in doing that, they had the number one say to say, well, you interpreted it the right way or you didn't interpret it the right way. 9 times out of 10, 10 times out of 10, if you look like me and you was trying to do it down there, they'll find a way to say no. So, you're dealing with a social kind of factor, the intimidation factor. And then when you actually get in front of there, you're dealing with that as well. So they use that influence to keep people down. The Governor Barnett, he was a part of the Citizens Council, and he took office from 59 to 63. So from 1959 to 1963, by fact, the Citizens Council was the government. They were the Chamber of Commerce. They were the police. They were everything. And so this really put African-American folks in a tough position to say, well, I want to make a living. I want to be able to live, and I want to have an opportunity to move forward, but maybe we can do it without voting. Another interesting thing about the state of Mississippi was that was the majority Black population in the country. So in the state of Mississippi held the most African-American folks. And in many of these counties, districts, parishes, some places will call them that, Black folks outnumbered them. So the powers that be knew that they had to rule with an iron fist over politics, because if you leave it up for grabs, if folks were allowed to register and use their political right, they can outnumber the majority of the state. Now you got a state legislature that looks different. You may have a governor's seat that look different. You might have your congressional seats that look different. So they really took hold in this power seriously. And so even when we talk about, voting in today's context, I think we lose sight sometimes, one, those of us who promote voting, that one, this is something that power does come from. But then two, those who, maybe look the other way and say, nah, I don't like the people. They ain't never do nothing for nobody. People in this country put their lives on the line to have that ability just to make the choice. I'm not saying that you got to have a good choice. I'm not saying you got to have a bad choice. I'm not saying none of that. All I'm saying is people put their lives, their freedom, and their humanity on the line to be able to do it. So when we think about this voting stuff, and we'll look at it a little bit later in the conversation, it's real deal, because if it wasn't, why would they try so many ways to get us out of the process? Even we saw just recently with some legislation saying that, a married woman whose name ain't the same as her birth certificate may not have that ability. Now, it looked like the Senate stepped up and kind of intervened in that. But even looking at that, or even looking at the people who said, for whatever reason, I'm staying out this race. If I'm standing on Israel and Palestine, if I'm standing on, I can't mess with Kamala. If it was, they ain't doing nothing for folks, no way. A lot of, or whatever, wherever you stood, you not standing on your vote. And you're seeing people getting deported. You're seeing people losing rights. You're seeing people, war happening in places where you wished it didn't, all because, or one of the reasons was because you didn't, say, I'm willing to stand up and use this vote. And now I get off my soapbox and I'll get back to the lesson. So, in this fight, it was a very unique and difficult fight. SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, found themselves in the fight as well. So as Megard Evers is organizing people, SNCC is involved, and they're trying to say, okay, well, let's bring this integration going to these Woodworth stores. Let's think about voting. Let's think about all these different kind of things. And so as you were encouraged to go vote or register, you could be fined, you could be jailed, you could be intimidated, and you could be, could let off in a really tough way. So serving as the NAACP's field secretary, Megard Evers started organized the boycott for the stores in Jackson. He rallied over 100 students in Jackson to march. Now, of course, those students were jailed, and they were, some brutalized. Mississippi said they were ready to hold 10,000 if necessary. So they said, we're ready for the tactics, because by 64, you also got to think, you're starting to see, you saw Birmingham, you saw Albany, you saw all of these different places where now the powers that be are really starting to get abreast and getting used to some of the tactics that civil rights leaders are using. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And so you're starting to see, these counties starting to really get ready to hold the fort on keeping people from using the tactics. So as that protest started to move forward, Megard Evers is making enemies. He's making enemies with the Citizens Council. He's making enemies with the powers that be. So to make a long story short, because I think it's more about, I won't make a long story short. So here, Megard Evers is organizing. He's putting things together. He's working with SNCC. He's working with students. He's energizing the base. He's getting people going. This is causing a really big impasse between he and the powers that be, even to the point where, he and his family were planning, okay, if you hear shots, this is what you do. If I'm not home, this is what you do. If it's this late and this happens, this is what you do. They even had a rule to say, when you come home late from your long days out, you don't, well, let me take a step back. So they lived, Megard Evers family and his family lived next to an open lot. So they had a rule to say, when you come home, don't get out of the driver's side, come out of the passenger side. So that way they would have, if they were going to shoot, they would have a harder shot at you. Well, one day, Megard, after a long day of organizing and sitting with his comrades, it was the same day that John F. Kennedy gave his speech in 1963 on civil rights. Long day, came home, and little did he know that there was somebody with a sniper ready for him. And so he got out of the car, and the story goes that he was shot in the back, and he pulled himself to the front door, and his family saw him shot, and he was eventually killed. And which was this was June 1963, and he was only 37 at the time. And being a part of NACP, they came and they saw him off and his family. And so it was really tough, because the momentum he was picking up, the enemies he were making, the progress he was making, willing to put his life on the line, to see him go, it was a blow to the movement in Mississippi, because they were thinking, take the head off of the leader and everybody will scatter. But what they weren't expecting was, we were going to use this as the linchpin to move the movement forward. So, we saw that, or let me get back to the case. I'm moving too fast. I started a little later than I wanted to, so I'm moving a little too fast. Let me slow down. So the case went to court. And of course, like we saw in the Emmett Till, like we'll see a little bit later with Goodman Schwerner in the Mississippi burning situation with the Freedom School, the people who came from up north down south during the Freedom Summer, went in front of a jury and was found innocent, Mr. De La Beckwith. And, while he wasn't convicted then, it brought a national spotlight to Mississippi again, and it kind of helped shape what was coming next. So his murder and assassination also, kind of raised a spotlight in that the president called for his body to be moved to Arlington Cemetery, and he died and he was laid there, because he was a veteran anyway, but he was given full veteran treatment and full colors and laid to rest up in Arlington Cemetery, where the great American leaders are buried. So this, he got his just due in his death. However, so the case went forward and nobody was found guilty, but his family wouldn't let go of it. And over the years, they found that, well, to make a long story short, they found that, let me say this. So every time that the De La Beckwith gentleman was brought up on charges, it would be a hung jury. So he never was found innocent. He just never was found guilty. So that door of just a hung jury kept the door open for you to get retried. So Byron De La Beckwith, that's the gentleman's name. So hung jury after hung jury. In 1989, a journalist got a hold of some old documents that showed that the Sovereignty Commission, which was a commission in Mississippi of a byproduct of the Citizens Council, they were interfering with the trial and the defense during the case. So you would have, the state of Mississippi versus this person, and you had information going from the records to the other side. So you could never get the kind of information you needed, because they were playing both ends against the middle. Well, fast forward, and 25 years later, In 1994, when Beckwith was in his 70s, it was brought to trial again. And in 1994, 31 years after the murder, he was brought to justice and sentenced to life. For the family, especially his wife and his children, it was at least some kind of closure. But to see justice delayed over 30 years for something that everybody knew that happened, the gentleman was bragging about it, saying, I want people to know I did it. I just don't want to face the consequences for it. And the good old boys allowed that for years. So gentleman ended up serving life. To me, it was bittersweet in that one, justice was served, but 30 years after. But for some, if you flip the coin, though, for some people were murdered and killed and justice was never served. So I guess justice is better served later, better served cold than not served at all. So 30 years later, his murder was solved, and he and his family could finally rest knowing that justice ended on their side. But rewind back to the moment. So now you have a situation going on in Mississippi. Well, no, I'm going to do this. Last week, I failed to do this. So let's take a moment and let's look at Megard Evers' life through this video that I have prepared a couple minutes. And then we'll talk about setting the stage for the next one. See, I'm slowing down this time. I'm moving too fast. So let me share my screen, and then we'll be able to talk about this. Any question about Megard Evers and his plight, feel free to drop it in the chat, and I'll answer that when we get back from this quick moment here. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'll get it popping here.
The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. Where legal remedies are not at hand, redress is sought in the streets, in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tension and threaten violence and threaten lives.
In 1963, Medgar Evers had organized what became known as the Jackson Movement, a multifaceted campaign to end racial discrimination and segregation in Mississippi. When he came back from World War II, though he had served his country, Evers remained a second-class citizen. He wanted to desegregate public accommodations in nonviolent ways. He worried for his life, that he recognized that the campaign to end segregation could potentially end with his violent murder. This picture, to me, is a kind of climactic moment. In the straw hat and wearing the sunglasses is Roy Wilkins, the head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, who had come to Jackson to support Evers.
Wilkins acknowledged that the youth of the country were becoming disenchanted with the legal pursuits of equality, and we're moving toward more militant means of expression. Evers always believed in that. He was really a frontline person. When you consider a photograph as a primary document in your historical research, you have to understand that although it's a primary document, although it's a slice of life, although it's an actual moment in history, it is indeed biased. Photographers are biased also. Medgar Evers and Roy Wilkins are surrounded, almost confined and constrained by the presence of the police officers. One police officer is writing out the citation, so he's got the power in this scene. Another officer is holding the cattle prod, so he too has the power. Although I think it's a dignified capturing of the event because the photographer chose to show these two African Americans standing tall. They are facing their accusers. Photographs were very useful on a national scale to bring the violent realities of the movement to more people. Kennedy did appear on television. And he did speak about how the country had to move forward. That night, the shooters, after that speech, the shooters did away with Medgar Evers.
It's not surprising that he is buried with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Overnight, he became a martyr for the civil rights movement.
You take the events that happened prior to this photograph, you take this and other photographs like it. You take the president getting on board and saying something has to be done. You take him getting on television, promoting civil rights, and then immediately following, Evers losing his life. It's the cumulative effect of this ball of energy, I think, that moved Congress and moved the American people to do more.
This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened.
All we want you to do is keep going with this fight for freedom. And when we get this unity, ladies and gentlemen, nothing can stop us. We're going to win this fight for freedom.
Yeah, very well said. So, Megard and his plight. Wow, I don't like giving. I hate the martyr syndrome we always have to go through. I did it even with Emmett Till and some of the others. A big part of the movement was national attention, because a strategy that was used, and we've seen it time after time after time after time, was, and this has always been the problem around states, when people say we want states' rights, states' rights. Well, in these situations, with you in Alabama, you in Mississippi, you in Georgia, you in North Carolina, the state wasn't offering much of a help to you. So we always needed federal assistance and federal guidelines to help push our movement forward. So the only way we were able to do that, I'm talking about us as a collective during the civil rights time, was to use media and use press and use pressure to move the needle forward. So let's another time we're gonna jump a little bit in a little bit more into Megard Evers here before we move forward. So his plight was one that we needed as a martyr. I wish he could have stayed alive and saw the fruits of his labor. I wish he was able to see what came next, but we know in a movement there are some that pay the ultimate price. Later on, we'll talk about the Black Panthers and Huey P. Newton. He called it revolutionary suicide. That was the concept, to where, you die for the revolution, you die to keep it going. And that's one thing that Megard have to do. He believed in strong political and economic rights, especially for our people. He believed in freedom. He believed in equality. He believed also in, do for self-organizing. He got affiliated with the NAACP, and it was in his initiative, and we'll talk about more as we move forward, using that initiative to get things going, not waiting for things to get going, but being a part of the things that's stirring the mix to get it going. And so let's take a step back from Megard Evers and let's go a little bit further into Freedom Summer. So Freedom Summer was an amazing shift in tactics during the civil rights movement. Freedom Summer of 1964, SNCC. Well, before I do that, let me take a step back. As we talk about the Freedom Summer, we're going to talk about there's two parts to the Freedom Summer. One is the Freedom Summer itself through the freedom schools and political education and just kind of the cultural side. And then there's another side of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So let's start with just the Freedom Summer. So the Freedom Summer was 1964. SNCC and CORE and NAACP got together and said, now that we know that voting is the issue that we need to leverage, how do we go about doing that? So to talk about the Freedom Summer, we're going to do a couple of things. One, we're going to explain the purpose of the Freedom Summer, voter registration, education, and community organizing. We're going to discuss the influx of white college students and their role in the movement. We're going to highlight the risks that the volunteers took when they came down. We're going to look at the murders of Goodwin, Cheney, and Schwerner. If you ever seen the movie Mississippi Burning, it was around that, the three volunteers that came down and got lynched and also became martyrs to the movement to really move forward to what we saw later with the Voting Rights Act being passed. And then we're going to talk about the heightened national attention that came from that situation. So let's take a moment and just kind of level set on what the Freedom Summer was. So we started to see a trend like this in the Freedom Rides. If you remember the Freedom Rides, they said, okay, let's find a way to bring together old, young, let's bring together black, white, let's bring together clergy and non-clergy, student and non-student, and leverage America's conscience to say, okay, when it was just, 4 black girls or 4 black boys or all these black kids, it was one thing. But when you start to mix that pot up a little bit, you start to really see a response here. And so the long short of it was Bob Moses and SNCC said, you know what? Let's recruit the powers that be up north. Let's recruit their children. So let's go to NYU. Let's go to Harvard. Let's go to Yale. Let's go to all these schools in the north, all of these, progressive liberal folks. And let's recruit some of these people to come down south and assist with us, SNCC, what we're doing down here. And let's bring them together and let's see what happens when this happens. And so it was a change of tactics to say, okay, well, it would have been easy to say, let's go to every HBCU down south. Let's bring them to Mississippi and let's register people to vote and build community, which, we did through all the other instances we were talking about. But this time they said, okay, let's take this aspect and let's mix up this pot to say, now you got the judges' kids down here. It's going to be different. Now that you have the senators' kids down here, or the business owners' kids down here, now it's going to garner a different level of attention and a different level of support. And so I'm going to provide a lot more resources to further explain this, but I want to give you a crash course and then we'll watch the video for a little more information. So to make a long story short, it was a very intense and an attentive recruitment effort for these white students to come down south. Because prior to that, 1962, 1963, SNCC already was down there doing some organizing. So going to juke joints, going to churches, going to being a part of the neighborhood, being a part of the organizations. Because remember, back then, it was 2 sides of town. It was the white side of town, and it was over the tracks, the black side of town. So SNCC would come down there and just start organizing and just building relationships. And a lot of that, what they were finding was people are fearful. People are worried. They don't want to go down to the courthouse. Maybe they can't explain these things. But it took time to just build these relationships. And so you got people down there saying, look, man, we've been down here organizing for a couple of years. Yeah, we hit a wall, but we don't need no help. And we definitely damn sure don't need their help. And, the SNCC leadership is like, well, maybe this is something we can leverage. And even Fannie Lou Hamer, being one of those organizers down there, was saying, you know what, maybe we could use the help. Maybe we could use this as a strategy and a tactic to move forward. So they said, all right, let's see how this works. So at this time, SNCC was I'm going to call a well-oiled machine, but they grew and they were able to do more, as they went. So they were able to say, okay, we're going to put out petitions, or not petitions. We're going to put up flyers on these campuses, because SNCC chapters weren't just on HBCU campuses. SNCC chapters were wherever students were able to go. And now we're in the 60s, people were able to get to these campuses. So putting up flyers, you want to do some work, you want to do some work, you want to do some work, you want to do some work. We're going to do some civil rights work. And they had people apply. And so they would send out their field generals. I'm talking about SNCC, would send out their field generals to do interviews with these would-be students that were going to integrate and come down south to do some of this organizing work. And this was a very tedious task in that you had to find the right kind of ally. You needed to know several things. One, you're going to be working under some black folks here at SNCC. So, during them days, it wasn't a lot of people used to or willing to work under black folks like that. College educated, well organized, well spoken for, been a part of the movement since the 50s, black folks, students. And then 2, a part of the gig was when you come down south, you are going to live under the tutelage of a black man and woman. You're coming into somebody's home and you're going to be living there in the summer. Part 3, you're going to be living in the community. So you had to have the right temperament. You had to have the right mentality. You had to have the right the right sense of service, because we're bringing you right into these people's homes, where you're going to be under their authority. If they say, well, you know, you don't need to be going down Main Street after this hour, then you don't need to be going down Main Street at this hour. You don't need to be walking down the street by yourself. Well, you don't need to be walking down the street by yourself. So you had to have understanding where you're going to be working for the brothers and the sisters in SNCC, and you're going to be under the tutelage, kind of like a domestic exchange of these families down south. So they met in Ohio to do these interviews and say, okay, well, we're going to figure out what's going on. And then we also have to teach you about the terror and the what you're really walking into, because a part of what SNCC was getting was they were saying, well, you know, are you guys doing this for fun? Are y'all doing this for stunts? Are y'all bringing these people down here as a lamb to the slaughter? Well, when we were students coming down there, we were going down there, we were just as much of a lamb to the slaughter. But now, because they look different and they're from a different background, now people starting to care and thinking you're doing something you ain't got no business. But then even SNCC is saying, you know, can we take this liability on? Is this something that we want to, you know, these are questions, you know, within the organization. Is this something that we want to kind of deal with? And ultimately the questions were, yes, they found the right people. They found the right people who were willing to kind of navigate. And so they had a tight organization. So their plan was this. SNCC, because they were already there for a few years, they set up regional offices. Let's just say north, south, east, west. I'll bring up the map later. North, south, east, west of the state of Mississippi. And you had these regional offices where you would deploy these volunteers, these field organizers, and these regular folks from Mississippi into all the black parts and cities of Mississippi. So, you know, yeah, you might know me, but you're going north in these cities and you have this central office that you're dealing with. You might be going south, you might be going east, you might be going west. And so they ran this tight kind of system to say, we want to get coverage in the whole Mississippi with the goal of doing three things: registering people to vote, running these freedom schools where you get cultural and educational history, culture, and we want to organize and just build bonds with people. So we're talking about the entire state of Mississippi. And so people coming down from New York, they're coming down from all these different places, and they're going to be sent to these regional offices. And then from these regional offices, you're going to be sent north, south, east, and west. So it's a very intricate plan. And ain't no social media back then. It's phones, it's letters, it's telegrams. So you're having a very unique way of doing this. So to get prepared, Mississippi is thinking that, you know, I think they kind of wanted to. They was thinking it was going to be some kind of hell off rebellion and people were going to be ready to riot and do all this stuff. So the powers that be got extra officers. They were getting military vehicles and they were ready to kind of get it rolling. But because there's two sides of the line or two sides of the city, they didn't know what was necessarily going on. All they knew were they were coming in via bus, and we can watch who's coming in via bus and we can watch who's coming in via cars. And so the main thing was get these people into Mississippi. When you cross the state line, you got state troopers waiting at the state line at all points, ready to figure out, you know, who's going in. And once we got you here, we embed you into Black community. So you're harder to find because back then you didn't cross a lot of lines. And so you had these volunteers coming. You know, they weren't all white. There was some white, it was some Black, it was some young, it was some, they were all students. And so you integrate them into society, into the Black part of society, where you would start to build your freedom schools. So, and I'll fast forward a bit. So you get the volunteers here, you get the things going, you get the freedom schools rolling, you get the community community organizing activated, and then you get the big first tremor to move through Mississippi. So June, school gets out in June. So you're there in June. This is one of the first things that happen. Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, all college students, were called by the SNCC office and said, hey, you know, because a part of their work is civil rights work. There was a church, Zion AME Church. People got beat up over there. The church got bombed. Go over there and take some interviews and figure out what's going on, bring the information back. So these three go and they talk to people and they do the work, the civil rights work that they do, because you have to also think about it. You're getting students. Some might be pre-law. Some might have been law. Some might have been journalists. Some might have been cartoonists. Some might have been education majors. So you got people with skills, black and white, going to do this civil rights work, and so you can bring it back. And so they get down there, and to make a long story short, they find themselves arrested. They take a car, they go, and they get arrested. They get let out from the jail at like 10 o'clock at night. Lo and behold, no one ever hears from them again. This car was stopped at 3 p.m. and they were arrested. They were let out of jail at like 10 that night. And after that, no one heard from them. And so now you go back to the SNCC and the rest of these organizers, where they're saying, hey, man, we did all the training. We did all of the getting you ready. We did all of this stuff. We told you how dangerous this is. Well, 3 of your colleagues are missing. And if you doing civil rights work in Mississippi during that time, if you missing, it ain't gonna find you again. You lynched, you done. And so this sent a shock through the Freedom Summer, because one, for SNCC and NAACP and CORE, their worst fear was confirmed. We got these folks down here and they got themselves killed doing the work that we had them doing. And then 2, you had your volunteers facing the fear of, oh, this is serious business. Mommy and daddy can't save us. Mommy and daddy can't get us up out of this. We here, and this is serious. And so people are really having to question: 1, do you want to still be here? 2, should I be here? 3, can I do this work? 4, oh my God, I didn't know it was this bad. In the fact that these were an integrated group, it was a lot of lines that were being crossed. 1, in Mississippi, you couldn't even organize, or you couldn't even be seen in an integrated capacity at all. So you have that going against you. 2, you got white women who were considered at that time, the pride and joy of the white community, living in a black community under the jurisdiction of a black man and a black woman among these young black men. Back then you can get hung for just whistling at a white woman. So you got these up northern white women coming down here who the judge and the sheriff and the police officers think they're here for one reason, and that's to, get in bed and do all this stuff with these brothers, which may or may not have been the case. These people are young. It was people, people were attractive. You did all that, that's another conversation for another day. And then you had just the fact that people from outside of the South are coming down there, these communists, as they call it, coming down here looking to change our way of life. So now it comes to a head. The story makes national news, and LBJ, who's the president at the time, it sends orders there to be a massive search. And even through this search, they're saying, okay, having to walk this line of, we're not here to protect people from doing this work. We're just here to find out what is going on and find these bodies and bring some justice to these bodies. So you have, this search for these young men happening all over the state of that region where they were found. And you're having, at the same time, you're having these freedom schools going. So the other side of the conversation is, okay, you have people all around the state that are doing several things. They're teaching these freedom schools. So these were meant for kids, but you got, since they were happening at different times, you had, people who are 80, 70, 60, 50 joining these freedom schools where they're learning African-American literature, African-American history. You're learning arts, literature, cultural things. So it's becoming a hotbed in these communities, which are segregated. So the other side don't really know what's going on. You're getting, just to be funny, not even to be funny, to be real about it, you're getting black folks able to really see what it's like to live with, talk to, interact with white folks from up north, because you don't look at no white person in their face. You damn sure don't live with them. You might work for them, but you don't live with them, talk to them. So you're building community. You're starting to see, oh, we really aren't really that different on both sides. You got people risking their lives being here. So you're seeing a lot of cultural exchange. You're seeing a lot of cultural accommodations happening, and you're starting to see a lot of hand-in-hand growing, changing, and building. So you're getting, freedom schools. I was a part of freedom schools in Detroit back in the mid 2000s and in the late 2000s in DC. So it's a way that you ingratiate young people around literacy. You ingratiate community. So you're looking to just build. So you at the juke joint, you at the community festival, you're just building, and your young people are finding a way to ingratiate themselves to do great work in community and great work in politics as well. A big part of what they were doing down there were registering people to vote. And so, they're sending people out 2 by 2, and they're saying, hey, I'm such and such from such and such place. We're looking to register people to vote. Do you want to register? Now, like I mentioned earlier, people are like, man, I ain't trying to put my life on the line. Yes, I do, but no, I don't want to. So even if you are getting the opportunity to go register to vote, you go down there, you got to, pass the literacy test. You can't do that. Or you got to interpret the Constitution. You can't do that. And now your name is on the list. Well, the woman that worked for you, your maid, well, she trying to register to vote. And they come in and say, oh, Hattie Mae, I can't believe you registering to vote. Now, if the Mr. found out, he would be so upset. And I would hate to see anything happen to you. And of course, you got to be like, well, no, sir, somebody told me to do something, but I don't know what I was doing. I was just, you trying to fight for your life. You trying to just stay alive. You trying not to end up on a tree. And so SNCC is really finding it difficult to get people registered to vote because people are having to put their lives on the line. And then these people from up north are really starting to see like, man, I can't believe this is really happening. I watched TV and I seen the Montgomery bus boycott and I seen this and I seen that, but this is really happening. Oh my God, I really got to do something about this. I really have to. And so as the freedom schools move along and as things are happening, the idea to start a new party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, was born, which said, okay, we're looking to find federal representation at the 1964 Democratic Convention to say, we want to bring our delegates versus the traditional delegates, and we want a seat at the table. So they kind of changed the strategy. They said, okay, well, if we can't get you to vote because of the intimidation, we can't get you to vote because of the laws on the books, literacy, poll tax, all these things. How about we organize around something else, still around voting rights, and we want to bring national attention to what we're doing to get them to maybe push the envelope to stop some of these literacy tests and poll taxes and intimidation. So what they said is, okay, we're gonna organize a new party. And if we get enough numbers, we'll be able to go to the Democratic Convention and we'll be able to use that and leverage that to bring the spotlight back down. So over the summer, they did that. Okay, are you willing to register to vote? Oh, no, Miss Charlie gonna put me on a tree. Okay, well, all right, cool. Are you willing to sign up to be a part of the Mississippi Freedom Democrats, where we ain't got to go down to the courthouse? We gathering signatures here, and we're going to take them signatures up north, and we'll have the conversation there. So you're safe, you are going to be covered, and it's a lot easier. So the form is a lot easier to fill out. What we're asking from you is a lot less intrusive, and we're going to take the issue up north, and you ain't going to have to deal with the backlash here. That was a better proposition. And so they started to organize, they started to get these numbers, they started to get people signed up in hopes to have a state convention in August, and then go from there to the national convention. So that's cooking. So you got these freedom schools cooking, and you got the registering to vote happening in the Mississippi Democratic Party. So another part of the freedom schools, let's go back to the freedom schools a little bit. So you're bringing volunteers from up north. So you're having legal representation, pre-law, law people who can help you with some of the legal issues you may have. You had doctors or would-be doctors, nurses coming. So you had medical clinics opening up, and then you had the educational part. Man, this is about Egypt. This is about Ethiopia. This is about our history, with our history. So you're having all these things happen, similar to kind of how, if you remember during the first class when we were talking about what was going on in these schools after slavery was over. So you're getting an education, you're getting an opportunity to learn. Now, keep in mind, it's just a summer, but you on the Delta in Mississippi, it ain't a lot to do. Or you in the backwoods, that's what they call backwoods Mississippi, any education you can get is better than, what's going on. So you're getting intermingling of these cultures, you're getting political education, you're getting SNCC still pulling the envelopes or still pulling the strings and making sure all this stuff is going on, because they still want to get people registered. If you can't get them registered, we want the Freedom Democratic Party to grow, and that's what we want to get going. So We're moving through the summer. Things are moving away. They want to. So SNCC opened up 41 freedom schools across the state. And many, so when people did find out this was going on, what was going on the other side of the tracks, you know, it was met with resistance. It was met with resentment, even if they found out, and some of it was even towards their own. So it wasn't even about, you know, what the niggers are doing. It's about these white folks down there helping. Yep, love freedom schools. Yeah, that was something that, and I kind of took it for granted back then. I didn't know the importance of it until I really start doing my research now. Like, man, I was a part of something that was huge and something that I wish I could have maybe had more of an impact with back when I was, you know, of that age. So we fast forward through the summer. We get into the end of the summer, 8/4, August 8th, the bodies were found. And the bodies were found, 2 of them were just shot, and 1 of them was found with bones and skull fractures. I wonder which one of the 3. It was 1 brother, 2 white dudes. Another part of the story, which I won't get too much into, they'll cover it in the video that I'll show. This became a national story. So the wife of one of the 3 that were murdered went to go see the president, went to put pressure on him, went to really get things riled up, where there used to be Dr. King having to do that, or used to be the Big Six having to do that. You're starting to see civil rights happening through another lens now. And you're starting to see things really start to take place. The bodies were found, and because of the makeup of what was going on, you're starting to say, okay, the mothers and the families of these 3 wanted these bodies buried together, but because of Mississippi law, things had to be segregated. They couldn't. And one of the turning points for the movement, and I won't show this video here, but I'm going to put it in the link that we can go, is Dave Dennis of CORE gave a eulogy at one of the funerals of Cheney, at his funeral, which actually kickstarted another movement. The rest of it was a turning point in the movement. And I see we got a couple comments here. Let me hit those while we go. Got to tell us what you did with the freedom schools, if you have the time. Yep, I mentioned earlier, 1 year I served as the student leader intern in the city of Detroit, all the way on the east side at the I don't remember. I used to know the place, but it was so long ago. Where I served for middle school, basically a teacher over the summer for middle school kids. And then in DC in 2009, I led a creative writing class for the scholars at Maya Angelou Public Charter School in DC, in Northeast DC. So yeah, it was a very fulfilling experience. And I wish I would have known what I was doing back then, and the place that it was in history. And a lot of people I knew during that time were a part of freedom schools and were really some of the most kick-ass, amazing, dedicated people who I have very fond memories of were a part of freedom school. So yeah, I may drop the link when the video is on. I'm gonna drop the link to the Dave Dennis eulogy, because it was very important that, you know, we were at a point where that murder really changed the complexion of the work that was going on down there. So as freedom school started to end, the summer is ending, and over 60,000 people were involved with either signing up for the party, attempting to register to vote, attempting to maneuver. So that it was a successful effort in that. And so let's move. Let me see. Let me see 1 second. No, I want to talk about both, and then we'll show the video then. So you have a group of people organized to join the 1964 Democratic Convention with the hopes of saying, well, since we can't get our just due at home, let's show you and tell you what we've done in Mississippi over this summer as far as our political education and what we've been up to, and let's find a way to get some representation here. The delegation was built from 70 people, 64 blacks and 4 whites. We're talking about maids. We're talking about cooks. We're talking about teachers. We're talking about sharecroppers. We're talking about preachers. We're talking about industrial people. We're talking about the real Mississippi being a part of this. And so they got to Atlantic City with their plans. And so one thing that would happen was you had to go in front of the, let me find it here. I think it's a very important part of the conversation. You had to go in front of the credentials committee to be recognized. So you had a group of delegates coming from good old Mississippi saying, okay, delegates here, the people who are elected to state office, people who are Democratic district representation down in Mississippi, some of the good old boys, they there saying, okay, we're here to take our seat. And they said, well, you got a whole group of other folks here to say that they want a seat at the table and have a conversation. So they had to go in front of I want to make sure I get it right, the credentials committee, to see which side was going to have their say. And so you have, this is where Fannie Lou Hamer gave her famous "Is This America" speech, which I'm going to show because I think it's very important to the cause. And then I'll show a video just about the whole Freedom Summer and everything that they did, like a commemorative. She gave her speech, "Is This America?" Which was a pivotal moment in the convention. So now you got LBJ in an election year looking to keep his seat and to be the Democratic candidate. And he knew that if he were to kowtow too much to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, that he may lose his support for winning the seat and being the president. So as good politics goes, and I'm saying that with quote marks and tongue in cheek, he put his people out to put out some of these fires. So make a long story short, you get Fannie Lou Hamer up to give her speech, her testimony in front of the entire delegation, all the Democrats from around the country that are going to the convention. And 3 minutes through her, amazing speech, LBJ takes TV cameras and say the president is going to give an address to stop her momentum, and he had nothing to talk about. I think it was like 9 months since JFK was murdered, and he got on there just bumbling and getting through whatever he had to say to steal her thunder, because people were really starting to be sympathetic. She's an amazing speaker with an amazing story. She's an organizer. She's an activist. So she lit that mug on fire with her speech. And so that was one tactic that they used. Let's stop this. And then he deployed his politics and say, well, hey, if you want your judge seat, you better not side with them. You want to be vice president, you better do this. You want this in the party, you better do this. And so you got this big political machine against this hopeful, politically naive, especially to national politics, a group of people who are just going with everything that they got, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, just to get their representation. Even Adam Clayton Powell came to the table like he was a progressive black representative from Harlem, New York, saying, hey, what you're doing, and two, if they offer you something, take it. So to make a long story short, they said, okay, no, you're not going to get representation, but we'll be willing to offer you 2 seats at the delegation. 70 people that just came through a hellish summer organizing, putting political power in place, building community. And they like, hell no, we don't want that. And he like, well, Clayton Powell's like, well, do you know who I am? Talking to Fannie Lou Hamer. You know who I am? Yes, sir. I know who you are. You Adam Clayton Powell. But have you ever been down south? Have you ever had your son lynched? Have you ever picked cotton? Have you ever did any of this stuff? I see your point. And we're not here for 2 seats. We're here for the whole thing. So to make a long story short, politics stood, and they offered the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party 2 seats on the delegation. They voted to reject, and they kind of left unfulfilled and unvictorious, if I can use that word, or not victorious. But they knew that the work continued, and they knew that they still had work to do because they still wanted to have the ability to organize and to register people to vote down south. So while it was another setback, we didn't get what we wanted. One, we brought a major spotlight. So first, the Mississippi burning, the Goodwin Cheney murder and lynching brought attention to what was going on in Mississippi. These Mississippi Freedom Democrats brought the attention that would eventually help push the envelope to where the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. And some of those tactics that were used down south they weren't able to use. So let me take a moment for us to watch this commemorative video and then Fannie Lou Hamer's speech, and then we'll move forward in our conversation. I hope you guys are getting something out of this. Yeah, this country, yeah, afraid of the truth, still afraid of the truth. So let me share my screen here, and then we'll get going with the Fannie Lou Hamer. I've been moving a little faster because I want to get us out of here at a decent time on this rainy, especially here where I am, Sunday here.
In our Sunday Spotlight, an unlikely alliance that made history. Idealistic white volunteers from the North teaming up with courageous blacks in the South to take on the Jim Crow culture 50 years ago this summer. They called it Freedom Summer, the title of a new documentary on PBS, and Martha Raddatz spoke with the filmmaker Stanley Nelson.
It was 1964. African Americans had been given the right to vote almost 100 years earlier, yet fewer than 7% had registered, and it was no wonder.
You'd be fired from your job if you even tried to go down and register to vote. If you had a loan, any kind of loan, they would cut your loan. They would publish your name in the paper. Then there was something called the registrar who would then make you take a test. And inevitably, if you're African American, you fail.
You didn't write anything in there. You didn't pass it.
Stanley Nelson's new film is a deep and at times unsettling look at the brave women and men who fought for voting rights just 50 years ago.
You have your certificate showing that you are a registered voter.
Civil rights organizers in Mississippi had been fighting an uphill battle to register African Americans.
We must be stronger than the enemy.
They needed help from outside the state and looked north.
They invited 700 volunteers, mainly white college students.
Students who had no idea what they would be getting into.
One of the things that surprised me is there was tension.
Part of the frustration with the organizers was trying to say, this is what it's going to be like down there. They could see that the kids didn't really understand it.
You're going to wind up in jail. I suggest we be a little more serious about this thing.
But that would quickly and tragically change.
They went missing on the first day of Freedom Summer, the very first day.
On June 21st, 1964, three young activists, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner from New York and James Chaney from Mississippi, vanished.
The people who understood Mississippi knew that they were never going to be found alive.
The bodies not discovered for 6 months. Those murders dramatized in the movie Mississippi Burning.
It put this kind of, shadow over the whole summer.
For his film, Nelson shares the real-life stories of the once young freedom fighters who lived in fear every day.
They put this noose over my head, and it's attached to a long rope. They jumped back into the car, and I just saw myself being dragged to death.
It wasn't just intimidation. They were killing people.
One of the terms that people always use for what was happening in Mississippi was terrorism. That, they were being terrorized.
After Freedom Summer, after those murders, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, which banned discrimination in voter registration. Last year, a sharply divided Supreme Court struck down a key part of the law, citing racial progress since Freedom Summer. But have we gone far enough?
I think it's really important that we understand the struggle that we had to go through to get people the right to vote, and that probably that struggle isn't over.
For this week, Martha Raddatz, ABC News, Park City, Utah.
And now we honor our fellow Americans who serve in sacrifice.
Yeah, and this was 10 years ago when they were looking to cut and gut parts of the Voting Rights Act, and you'll see later as I pull up, they're looking to do the same around school desegregation. So that was the Freedom Summer and kind of that movement. Let's go to the specific speech that Fannie Lou Hamer gave during the Democratic Convention in 1964.
Plantation had come to symbolize the Mississippi. Testimony was that of this convention. But the highlight of the testimony was that of Fannie Lou Hamer, the sharecropper who had been evicted from her plantation, had come to symbolize the Mississippi movement.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Credentials Committee, it was the 31st of August in 1962 that 18 of us traveled 26 miles to the county courthouse in Indianola to try to register to become first-class citizens. We was met in Indianola by policemen.
The president, Lyndon Johnson, he's not afraid of Martin Luther King's testimony. He's afraid of Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony. And so he decides that the country should not see her testify live.
Johnson is in the White House, and he convened an impromptu press conference.
We'll return to this scene in Atlantic City, but now we switch to the White House and NBC's Robert Goralski.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
On this day, 9 months ago,
He did it knowing that they would break away, thinking he might announce who his choice of vice president was going to be. Instead, he gets up there and he announces, get this, he announces that it's 9 months to the day since Governor Connolly, who was there, was shot along with President Kennedy. So he announced a 9-month anniversary. Everybody's scratching their heads.
thank you very much.
And then he leaves. And by that time, Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony was over. However, it backfired on Johnson because it became a story that she had been taken off television and in the news that night, and for days afterwards, they replayed her testimony.
I was carried to the county jail and put in the booking room. They left some of the people in the booking room and began to place us in cells.
She had Mississippi in her bones. Martin Luther King or the SNCC field secretaries, they couldn't do what Fannie Lou Hamer did. They couldn't be a sharecropper and express what it meant, right? And that's what Fannie Lou Hamer did.
And it wasn't too long before 3 white men came to my cell. One of these men was the State Highway Patrol. He said, "We're going to make you wish you was dead."
Yeah, I'll have the full speech in the notes when we leave. So it's a very interesting dynamic, and I'm gonna go back to my deck here. Freedom Summer, freedom schools that had, freedom schools, education and activism, community building, medical clinics, which you needed that back in the backwoods Mississippi, and political education, as we just saw. Over 60,000 people were affected and affiliated, not necessarily registered to vote at that moment, but would later. The murders of Cheney, Goodwin, and Schwerner, was a hotbed of attention for the movement, and it sucked that always had to happen. But I think, from a strategic perspective, if you think about it, going back to Emmett Till, our lives have been shed for this. And, if you believe in this issue, you can't live in a situation without being a part of it as well. So I give these young men the credit for having to be a part of it. I give the organizers and some of the volunteers from the Freedom Party, from the Freedom Summer, props for being a part of it. They actually got a chance to witness for a moment what it was like for us and to live. They got a moment to be afraid. They got a moment to be a part of this movement. And I'm grateful for that. But even after they were gone and that summer was over, we still had to deal with that stuff. And you would see later when we talk about what we're getting to for next week. The national attention brought, like we saw in the video, shock and outrage. The media really played a big role in getting those images and a lot of other things that you'll see in the notes. And if you got the stomach for it, you can watch Mississippi Burning. I don't have the stomach for it. I'd rather take what really happened in the dramatized version. But if you got the stomach for it, it is a worth of watch. I've seen it before. I just didn't watch it in preparation for this at all. The Freedom Party, looking to make a move, and they did. It was never easier. So I was gonna say it was easier. They didn't stop after 64. They kept to it, and when it was time to get people registered to vote, in the Voting Rights Act passed, and there was supervision over those states that would typically try to use those tactics to stop people from registering to vote. A large majority of people were able to register to vote. So they're like Albany. Their work wasn't in vain just because they didn't get a big victory. It laid the foundation for what was coming later. And the legislative impact, political representation and advocacy, and influence on future movements. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party will always go down as being, what it looks like to actually get that work done. The question around political power, I think, was interesting as well, because you even got a chance to see that power doesn't just come from people saying, no, you can't vote because you can't read this. No, you can't vote because this is our custom. It can come through just the norm. I want to be able to stay the president. I want to be able to control this. I want to be able to control that. And in doing that, political power is always the question. So when we think about it, even in today's, perspective, we take for granted sometimes that if we do organize, and if we do use our power, and if we do find our way to leverage our economics, our religion, and our political power, we can still navigate and make micro, hyper local change. It may not be at the federal level, but it may be in your own backyard. And I'll bring this down. And so I want to take a moment to take any questions and then talk about the class as we move forward. This will be the time where I would say, we're ready for your midterm. We're going to go over 1 through 5, and I'm going to send out the exam, and I need to do this time. But since we're not doing that, we could just talk about, have any questions and then move forward in our progress. So one thing I do want to do while some of that comes in, if any come, one, I want to thank you for being along the ride this far. Last class, we did 5 classes total and we were done. This time I really want to take my time, and I really wanted to provide an opportunity for us to look at these people. SNCC, we saw them just get organized after the lunch counter sit-ins in 60, and now 64, they're running a full-fledged campaign throughout the entire state. And one thing that really impressed me about SNCC, and I'll put a lot of this in the notes because it's a self-study for you to kind of dig there, those activists really were putting their lives on the line to say, I'm leaving whatever I'm doing. I'm coming down Mississippi, and I'm coming to ingratiate myself in society. And even how brave it had to be for those people to say, and I didn't talk about these cases where people actually walked up to the courthouse to actually go and get registered, knowing that Mr. Charlie, as they called him during that time, was looking for him. So I just always hearken back to, as we live through this time, as we go through this time in our political social lives, we got to know that, one, people did that before. And if we're called to do that, we can again. And so 64 was also a moment in history where, well, let me give a moment. This is Rube Foster and his team. So he was the owner of the Negro Leagues and the president of the Negro Leagues. I talked about him in our class prior, and this was his team. I wanted to just give a shout out to him sitting on my shoulder. But 64, as you heard in the one of the videos, was a turning point. People were saying, we've been doing this nonviolent thing. We've been doing this, and the next round of youth are coming in, and you're starting to get other messages. Malcolm and his movement is really starting to take hold intellectually. So these kids are drawn to Malcolm. These kids are drawn to that ideology of, hey, we did it this way and maybe it ain't working. I'm tired of seeing, and this is, I probably should have showed the speech from Cheney's eulogy. But we're tired of this. We're tired of this. We only got so much of this in us. And so 64, and we'll see moving forward in 65, as they get prepared for the Selma March, there's starting to be a different kind of temperature happening at the youth side of the table and the community side of the table. When we first started talking civil rights, we were talking about the preachers and SCLC. We were talking about the NAACP, more Du Boisian kind of perspective. But as it's changing, we're starting to see white people in the movement. We're starting to see young people in the movement. It was some protests that were happening where it was kids, high school kids, community people, more people who weren't necessarily involved in just the we shall overcome that we known. So we're starting to see a different kind of tenor happen. And so 64 was a part of the change. 65, it was Selma, which we're going to talk about next week, was a part of the change. And we're going to start to see how the movement is starting to become 10 years old. We started in 54 with Brown, but we looked at Emmett Till and we looked at Montgomery in 1955. We're up to 65 now. We saw the Civil Rights Bill passed. We're going to see the Voting Rights Act passed. So we're starting to see a different tenor and temperature happening within the movement. And so as we get to the next week, the Selma March was considered the last traditional march of what the traditional civil rights movement was. It was a time where SNCC was starting to lean more Black Power oriented. Dr. King was looking for a different victory. You will see him leave the South and go up north to Chicago later. And then we'll start to see ideologies of Malcolm and ideologies of what be the seeds of the Panthers really moving forward and taking shape. So I'm really excited about that as we move forward. What are the adults who were the kids doing? Where are the adults who are the kids doing this? Okay. Yeah. So during this time, so we talking about, now we're starting to talk about more of baby boomers. Now we're getting to that age. So now we're getting to the late 60s. So if you was born in the 40s, you get into the late 60s. Now you're starting to come to the table. So those are the college kids. Those are the people who were, are they MAGA? Okay. I get what you're saying. Okay. So the people who were part of the freedom movement, what happened to them? Like I came down to the Freedom Summer, what they turn out to be. So, it's funny because the movement kind of changed as the movement became more radical. A lot of support for the civil rights movement started to die. Like, for example, you got your Voting Rights Act, you got your Civil Rights Act, you got this, you got that. Oh, now you want Black Power? Oh, no, this ain't what I'm about. Nope. But then you also had some still were around saying, okay, well, this is the version that I support. I support the nonviolent version. I support this. I support that. So they really, let's see, I don't even know if they would be the grandparents now. They may have been, that was those were people who went down in 64. They was 20s in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, 2020s. That's 60 years later. So if they was 20 to 80, so they're probably on their way out of it. But yeah, that's a really good question. So a lot of them, so those were the people who had to live through affirmative action 80s and Black elected officials of the 70s and what Black Power actually meant. And then, how Black Power went the other way too, how the protests went. So a lot of them, it's interesting how that kind of ended up, but a lot of them ended up as supporters to a certain extent. So there we are. Next week, we're talking Selma. And then after that, we really start to dig into more of the Black Power conversation. We know that some really important dates, 65 in February. Disregard my question. No, you good. Listen, this is what this place is for. I love the questions. 65, Malcolm is killed. You have 68, Dr. King is going to die. And then you have the Watts riots, the Detroit riots of the late 60s. Then you get Panthers and Black Power of the late 60s and into the early 70s. We're going to stop the class in 68 with the Poor People's Campaign, but we will make room for Panthers and we will make room for how some of these riots went off. So we're starting to get to the point where, civil rights is changing and it's going to be interesting. But usually, and I'll say this as we have a couple minutes left. A lot of there was some arrogance that came from some of these people who were involved in the Freedom Summer and in the Freedom Rides. Oh, I marched with Dr. King. You can't tell me nothing about it. When in Detroit and in Philadelphia, I had to go down south. This stuff was happening in my backyard, we would say. Or I was a freedom rider. You can't tell me. Well, I freedom ride every day when I'm trying to get home from work and school. You can't tell me. So there was a privilege that came along with being a part of this movement. And as SNCC really started to change their gears, they wasn't ready to, some of this stuff, maybe we went too far with some of that. Maybe we don't want none of that. Stokely Carmichael, when he took over SNCC, we're going to see something different than what we've been seeing. You know what I'm saying? Even as some of the young people even as some of the Black Power turned inward and said, well, look, and if you ever watched a different world. It was an episode where Dwayne led one of the sit-ins at Hillman where they were going against the administration. Some of these students even said, look, the hell with it. We fighting outside, but we fighting inside. We want different accommodations here on campus. We want to be able to do this. We want to be able to do that. So the Black Power conversation really started to change some of the tenor. And then, like I mentioned earlier, people were starting to get restless with, okay, you got your Civil Rights Act. You got your Voting Rights Act. You got it. Get off of it. And Dr. King's like, no, we ain't. And so the movement started to change. You started to see people, really start to kind of fracture. And that's why we said the Selma March was the really last kind of united march where it brought all those people who would have been on the march in Washington and all those people who were a part of the Freedom Rides and all those people who were a part of this Freedom Summer together. Now it starts to go in different directions because people saying doing it this way is not moving as fast as we want, and we want Black power. And that's absent of, and these are seeds of Malcolm. Malcolm is saying, no, this is how we should think. This is how we should go, which brought the Panthers, which brought the riots, which brought, some of these other things. So you start to see a fracture. So these were really good questions. I'm glad we had time for them. Next week, we're going to talk about Selma and move forward in that regard. The week after that, we get into some more Black Power conversations. And then we start to look at, kind of the other side of civil rights. So I want to thank everybody for your time today, 1 hour, 26 minutes. I'm going to send out, well, let me do this. I always do this for the people who are here who may not be a part of my mailing list. I'm going to drop the link here to register for the class because it's a part of what makes being a part of this movement so unique is you get the lecture notes, you get you get the lecture notes, you get the video, you also get resources. So I dropped the full outline of what the lecture was with links to find your own information and to dig and find your own. I call it cherry picking. You can't go through everything, but you can find 1 or 2 things we talked about today, match it up with the video and do your own research. And then I also add documentaries, full length documentaries, some of the clips we watch in class. I offer a lot more for you to take for your own independent study. Those who just jump in, you just get the lecture. So I'm encouraging people to sign up. That way you can get, and even if you sign up now, I'll send you everything. I had a good brother who I went to high school with say halfway through the first class, say, hey man, I missed some, but if you send it to me, I'll mess with it. And he came back to me later and said, hey, I watch these videos. I keep up with the information. I appreciate you. Continue to hold me down. And that's the kind of brand that I want to build is I'm going to give the information because it's necessary. I'm going to give the information because we need it. We don't know what day we wake up and hear that voting rights is on the table. Our citizenship is on the table, how we may need to organize, how we may need to do this, how we may need to do that. So the information is important, but also being a part of the movement is important too. So I want to thank everybody for your time today. As you go through your week, just think about what Megard Evers was able to do. Think about what the Freedom Schools were able to do. Think about what the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party were able to do as you go through and watch your news reels as we see what's going on in the state. Oh, it was one last thing I wanted to share before we get out of here. I do this class not because it is a joy all the time, because it's hard to relive these moments, but also because of what's going on in our local policy. If you were keeping up, and I'm going to share this, and I may read a bit, I may not. I definitely want to share this on my screen before we go. This isn't just talking about what's happening in the past. We're not just talking about what was going on in 64. This is from a couple of days ago, May 2nd. The Department of Justice drops decade-old desegregation school case in Louisiana. The Trump administration has dismissed a half-century-old desegregation case in Louisiana, a sign that it may aggressively end other school racial desegregation cases long targeted by white conservatives. Why it matters. The move by the U.S. Justice Department this week follows the Trump administration's reinterpretation of civil rights era laws to focus on anti-white racism rather than discrimination against people of color. Big picture. It comes weeks after the administration said the federal government will no longer unequivocally prohibit contractors from having segregated restaurants, waiting rooms, and drinking fountains. It also follows Trump's revocation of President Lyndon Johnson's decade-old order on diversity and affirmative action practices in the federal government. So as we talk about all of these things that our civil rights heroes were able to do, we're seeing it being undermanned and undermined every day. School desegregation, we just talked about Brown versus the board. We just talked about Little Rock Nine. We just talked about James Meredith. Public accommodations in the Civil Rights Act. We just talked about lunch counter sit-ins, Montgomery bus boycotts. We talked about freedom rides. So the things that we're talking about here are on the table now and being flipped over today. So they're talking about the civil rights now. Oh man, these great things they did all the way in the past. Well, we may have to find ourselves in a position to have to do some of this stuff again, because the laws that were protecting us are on the table and able to be on the chopping block. So I'm not just doing this as a victory lap for our ancestors. I'm doing it as a way to show what we were able to do back then and how we may have to move forward in fighting for our rights again. So I want to leave it with that. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your energy. This is AAS 477, Power and Protest. I wish everybody a great week, and we're going to do it again next week, 3 o'clock on Sunday. See y'all there. Peace.